Welcome back, everybody. Sorry I've been away for a while. I had to take care of some stuff in my professional life, and now that I'm back, I finally get to talk about this story that I've been wanting to talk about for a while. What are we going to be covering today? Well, we are going to be covering a story that this is 100% true. This is a story about a Chinese communist biolab that was discovered operating without the United States government knowledge or permission in Reedley, California. All of this information is coming from the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, the investigation into the Reedley Bio-Lab. This is the Select Committee that is in the United States Congress. We are going to be going over this document. We're not going to be going page for page, word for word, because a lot of this does repeat itself. I will be putting this in the video link below so you guys can follow along with me and then read some of the parts that I skip over. I'm not going to be skipping anything important. Just making sure that, this video isn't 3.5 hours long. I know sometimes I talk a little slow. Hopefully we don't have that issue today. So, getting right into it, what happened here? So we're going to skip the first page because it's going to cover itself again. So, what happened? The Reedley Bio-Lab was discovered in a warehouse located at the 850th Street in Reedley, California, across the street from a residential neighborhood next to a railway line. And it's a short walk from the town's high school, city hall, and water supply. The officials ultimately learned that Jesse Zhu, under the false identity of David He, had set up a facility engaged in fraudulent sales of medical device kits and other biological laboratory activity. So getting right into it, the owner and operator of this lab, his name is David He. His actual name is Jesse Zhu. Zhu did so after he and his associates had hastily moved from a previous location in Fresno, so this was not their first biolab. This is just the one that got found. The original one was in Fresno. The illegal laboratory is similar to Reedley's site due to a fire and threat of eviction. Zhu operated a biolab through the corporation Universal Meditech Incorporated, UMI, and later Prestige Biotech Incorporated. Prestige Biotech is what it went under. Officials first learned about the Reedley Bio-Lab thanks to the work of Code Enforcement Officer Ghislaine Harper, who identified the ardent garden hose, so a green garden hose, that was a building code violation outside the warehouse in December 2022. So, for putting up a timeline, the timeline starts in December 2022 when this was first discovered by Code Enforcement Officer Ghislaine Harper. What she saw was a green garden hose that was poking out of this building that they believed to be vacant for the last decade. After investigating the garden hose, she found this. Officer Harper observed 3 women who identified themselves as PRC, People's Republic of China, nationals wearing white lab coats, glasses, masks, and latex gloves. The women appeared to be packaging items for shipment. Officer Harper identified numerous building code violations, including unlawful electrical wiring. She also observed samples of potentially dangerous pathogens and biohazard signs. Further inside, she discovered that appeared to be approximately 1,000 white laboratory mice, which, according to the employees on site, were being tested. So, right off the rip, she sees this green garden hose, probably doesn't think anything of it. Maybe it's just some people squatting in the facility. She knocks on the door, walks in, and what does she find is 3 women who are in white lab coats who immediately identify themselves as People's Republic of China nationals. She sees laboratory equipment, numerous building code violations, which I absolutely love that that's what she's focusing on. She is Code Enforcement Officer after all. And then 1,000 laboratory mice. She referred the matter to the Fresno County and Federal Bureau of Investigations, as she should, approximately 2 months later, and according to local officials, the FBI informed her that it had closed the investigation because the Bureau believed that there was no weapons of mass destruction on the property. So, she referred this to the FBI and higher officials, as she should. Clearly, she realized that there is a lot more going on here. So, after 2 months of investigating, the FBI declared that there was no weapons of mass destruction and that they are closing their investigation, which seems very quick to presume that, especially after what we're going to find the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, ultimately did with their investigation. After consultation with California State, Fresno County officials, Officer Harper led a small group to the Reedley Bio-Lab and again requested access. So this is 2 months after when she's told that the investigation was closed. Two individuals, one of whom refused to identify himself, were present but quickly left after authorities arrived. Upon entering, Officer Harper noticed that there were now padlocks barring entry to most of the facility. So already, we're seeing that it's extremely sketchy. FBI closes their investigation super quickly. She goes to investigate again, leads a small group. They get there. Two individuals who refuse to identify themselves quickly leave after they appear. This is super sketchy, and it's just the first bit in a very, very weird thing that happens. Local officials then obtained an inspection warrant, which they executed on March 16th, 2023. So, first discovered in December 2022, FBI gets there 2 months later. They close the investigation. That should be around February. It takes some time for them to get a warrant. They come back March 16th. Inside the Reedley Bio-Lab, officials observed blood and tissue and other bodily fluid samples and serums and thousands of vials of unlabeled fluids and suspected biomaterial. So, pretty crazy. They're seeing all these samples, all this stuff, all this biological material. This raised concerns that they contain pathogens. Some of these vials were labeled with names of pathogens in English or Mandarin. Many were unlabeled. Others were labeled in code. Officials never found the full key of which translated this code, meaning that the nature of these vials' contents is unknown to this day. We'll get into further why they remain unknown shortly. Officials found the laboratory equipment had cabinets and centrifuges, so standard medical equipment. Officials found laboratory equipment including biological safety cabinet and a centrifuge, as well as cold temperature storage units, which included two ultra-low temperature freezer units, -80 and -60 degrees below, and 29 refrigerator freezer units, -20 degrees Celsius, and 29 refrigerator freezers, which went down to -20 degrees Celsius. The ultra-low temperature freezers increased local officials' concerns that UMI was storing infectious agents on site, which they would not be too far off in being correct on that. The facility contained other storage containers labeled with biohazard signs and medical cabinets filled with what authorities later identified as highly flammable, explosive, and corrosive chemicals. They also found trace narcotics, laboratory equipment, and hundreds of boxes containing faulty medical devices subject to FDA health embargo. So they were manufacturing, huge air quotes on manufacturing, faulty medical equipment that they were then distributing as technically made in America. Moving on, officials then had to deal with the over 1,000 mice that they found in there, not just because the area was dirty, but because they had these mice for medical testing. Approximately 1,000 mice were kept in inhumane, overcrowded conditions, which local officials asked a worker who appeared to be in control of the mice. She replied that they were transgenic mice that simulate human immune systems and were genetically engineered to catch and carry the pandemic virus. It says the specific virus, but because this is YouTube, I can't say the actual one. You can figure out which virus I am speaking of. One of the workers who tended to the mice told Officer Harper that he and his children had become sick in close time to when he was tending to the mice. The worker stated that he was instructed to discard any dead mice that he found into a dumpster. The worker thereafter stopped communicating with officials. So this is the worker outright saying that these biolabs that were UMI and Prestige Biotech were disposing of medical waste in unsafe and unlicensed ways. Typically, when you have medical waste, you need to have a special licensed medical waste hauler that takes this stuff away, because certain medical waste can have different diseases in it, and they can cause potential for spread, like having to deal with medical waste such as dirty needles, dirty gauze, in this case, laboratory mice. Say something, eats that laboratory mouse that has disease. Now it's going to spread somewhere. That's why we need to have special regulations for that stuff, which they were not doing. Shortly after dealing with these mice, Prestige Biotech representative Zui Qin Yao emailed City of Reedley officials and asked about the mice. He stated that the mice were a special, purebred population that took 6 years to build up and are of special significance in the study of immunology and oncology. Yao furthermore said that the transgenic mice were biological assets and were worth hundreds of thousands or even $1 million. Yao said that she cannot go to the United States or the Reedley Bio-Lab as she is currently in the People's Republic of China and is unable to enter the United States due to a visa backlog. So you have a person from the People's Republic of China emailing city officials asking for the mice back because they are of special importance to her, but she cannot come to the United States herself because she does not have a visa. Despite repeated requests, she failed to provide any certifications or licenses from any state or federal agency for storage and experimentation on mice and other laboratory activities at the Reedley Bio-Lab. Moreover, the property, UMI, and Prestige Biotech were not licensed as or not listed as licensed laboratories and were likewise not regulated by the CDPH as medical waste generators. The CDPH is the California Department of Public Health, so they're not licensed in the state of California or the United States at all. After all of this and dealing with the mice, what they ultimately did was they brought a veterinarian in who examined the mice and found that they were not immediately dangerous to people or dangerous for possibly spreading diseases. So unfortunately, they had to euthanize all of the mice, which unfortunately, fortunately for the mice, they don't have to live in those terrible conditions anymore. Unfortunate that it had to come to that. As part of their review, local officials uncovered marked and unmarked fire, danger, and explosive hazards created by corrosive, toxic, and highly flammable chemicals stored in the Reedley Bio-Lab. These materials were highly dangerous were a fire to occur. Fire department officials assessed that the city of Reedley would have to evacuate at least one city block around the warehouse, and their proposed evacuation zone would include the City of Reedley Police Department, City Hall, Kings Canyon, Unified District Main Office, and approximately 12 residential homes. The potential blast radius would increase significantly if the fire were to spread to the gas station next door. So alongside with this biolab being in the middle of a pretty large residential area, being close to the city water supply, being close to rail lines, it was also next to a gas station, and they housed corrosive chemicals that could be probably classified as ticks or TIMS, had the place gone up in flames, which is what happened to the first biolab that the local officials did not find, but it was found later that they were operating in Fresno. While inspection process was ongoing, Jesse Zhu, this is the individual who was responsible for the biolab, who was using the fake name of David He, began communicating over the phone and via emails with local officials. He said that he was a special representative of UMI. He asked for local officials to not destroy the pathogen samples. Instead, he asked that they allow him to move them off-site using a company that was unlicensed for medical waste or pathogen transport. Local officials did not permit Zhu to do so. Zhu also provided contact information for corporate officers, all of whom were in the PRC, People's Republic of China. So, the audacity of this guy. The audacity. This guy, who we later find out, massive international criminal with major ties to the People's Republic of China, who was caught operating 2 biolabs in the United States with no licenses or anything that allowed him to do so by the United States government, then calls and asks if they can not destroy all of the biological samples that he had illegally, and if he can move them using another unlicensed, not at all regulated medical provider to move those samples, which we have no idea what they are because some aren't labeled, others are labeled in code, in Mandarin, or the ones that are labeled in English. We're going to find out what those were shortly, which thank goodness that the city of Reedley officials did not let them move those samples. Okay. We are about to get into the most confusing part of this entire document and this entire sequence of events. This is pertaining to the CDC's handling of this entire situation, which even if you don't know anything about how the CDC operates, and you're just a regular person who all you know is that the CDC is a center of disease control, and then they were in that movie Contagion, was going to be extremely just confusing, because you would think that they would be responsible for controlling diseases at the Center for Disease Control. But as we will see here shortly, apparently that is not their job. So, based on initial observation in March 2023, local officials began to reach out to additional federal authorities for assistance. Local officials spent months repeatedly trying to obtain assistance from the CDC, both directly and through the California Department of Public Health. According to local officials, the CDC refused to speak to them, and on a number of occasions, it was reported by local officials that the CDC hung up on them mid-conversation. So the CDC would not talk to them about what was going on and just hung up on them as they were trying to get assistance for dealing with this. Local officials were similarly unable to get any help from other federal agencies that may have current authority to investigate and or remediate the biohazard substances found at the Reedley Bio-Lab. Ultimately, local officials contacted their local member of Congress, Representative Jim Costa, asking him for help obtaining federal assistance. It was only then, following Congressman Costa's advocacy on Reedley's behalf, that the CDC responded to the California state government and local officials' requests. So it took them asking their congressman and getting their congressman for the CDC to actually do anything. After significant effort, local officials were able to convince the CDC to inspect the Reedley Bio-Lab. So the CDC arrived on site May 2nd. So this was discovered in December of 2022, and it took the CDC all the way 5 months, May 2nd, 2023, for them to actually get on site. And from that time, they arrived on May 2nd, 2023, and they left May 4th, 2023. Now, this may seem very short. That doesn't actually seem too outrageous. Doing site exploitation and getting the samples that they shouldn't take that long, and they're not really going to be doing anything on site. So for them to be on site for only 2 days is not super outrageous. That is not the part that is baffling about the handling of the CDC here. Upon reviewing the site, the CDC reported, based on existing labels, that the facility contained at least 20 potential infectious agents, including HIV, tuberculosis, and the deadliest form of malaria. So this list that I'm about to read is all of the stuff that they found and can not confirm, but that was labeled. The list of all of the labeled substances that they found are as follows. The potentially infectious bacteria agents present, and I'm going to butcher some of these: Chlamydia, Trichomonas, E. coli, Helicobacter pylori, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, Mycoplasma pneumoniae and general Mycoplasma species, Neisseria meningitidis, Gnostic species, Sphagobacterium hepatarium, Streptococcus pneumoniae and Streptococcus species, and Toxoplasmosa gondii. This potentially infectious viral agents, so that was the bacteria, now we're getting to the viruses: hepatitis B, hepatitis C, dengue fever, human immunodeficiency virus HIV 1 and 2, herpes virus 1, herpes virus 5, respiratory syncytial virus, rubella virus, and severe acute respiratory syndrome virus 2. And potentially infectious parasites, malaria, believed to be P. falciparum from Nigeria from the year of 2000, which is the most infectious form of malaria around. So with all of these, they categorize some of them as risk group 2, which is associated with the human disease, which is rarely serious, and for which preventative and therapeutic interventions are often available. So it doesn't seem too bad. Right, just risk group 2, there's stuff that's available, they're curable, not super infectious. They also had risk group 3 pathogens, which are associated with serious or lethal human disease, for which preventative or therapeutic interventions may be available. These agents represent a high risk to an individual, but a low risk to community. Meaning, so if you get infected with it, that's a high risk to you. You need to go to the hospital and get intensive treatment, but they have a pretty low chance of spreading and causing serious disease in the community. So not going to cause a pandemic. However, the CDC officials confirmed that the CDC made this list of pathogens based solely on the labels that were placed on samples. The CDC did not test these samples to assess whether the listed labels were correct or otherwise in a cipher that the workers used for more dangerous pathogens. So the CDC decided to not test any of the samples that they found, whether they were the labeled, unlabeled, or labeled in Mandarin diseases, which I do not understand why. They try to justify that here shortly, even though both SARS-CoV and chimeric version of the currently endemic 19 are both select agents. Per the CDC, they classify the SARS-CoV, which they confirmed they had there at least labeled, and another chimeric version are both considered select agents. Remember that for later. Select agents are biological agents that the U.S. government has determined have the potential to pose a severe threat to public health and safety by the CDC's own admission that was present. Moving on, the CDC's refusal to test left local officials unable to assess the danger to the city of Reedley community or inform the community about what steps, if any, it should take to protect public safety. Local officials informed the CDC about their concerns, and the CDC continued to refuse to test any samples. According to the local officials, they had also asked the CDC if they could test a random sample of the pathogen. The CDC refused to test a random sample, and then despite their limited local budget, local officials then offered to pay the CDC for the entirety of the cost of testing, because thinking that maybe this is a budgetary thing, this is a huge thing, we'll pay it, we'll front the cost, please just test this so we know what's around. And the CDC still refused and did not test this sample. They did not take any samples with them, and they left the site with all of the samples. They did not take any of the samples with them to the CDC or anything to where they can discard it. They actually left the cleanup process to all of the local officials. The CDC summarized its finding in a 3-page report in which it stated that the biolab contained thousands of vials with unclear labeling, coded labeling, or no identifications. Lab workers appeared to have labeled some items they believed to be dangerous, although some of these pathogens could have come from Nigeria or Canada. During the move to the United States, the infectious materials may have been imported. We'll get into that a little bit later. There was no import or shipping records available of these, so we at least have international trafficking of pathogens included in this. Again, outright admitted by the CDC that this could have happened. Despite the fact that the Reedley Bio-Lab was an illegal enterprise, the CDC suggested that local authorities request all records of importation for infectious agents to see if there were any violations occurred. The CDC's actions of items would be sent to the company advertisement letters and on import requests and the federal requirements of select agents. So the CDC was saying, basically, we'll just send them an ad telling them, hey, make sure that you do all this next time. Even though it had not tested any samples from the Reedley Bio-Lab, the CDC concluded that there was no evidence of select agents or toxins. The CDC said there is no evidence of select agents or toxins, even though if we go back to their official list that they gave out, it has a select agent listed right at the bottom, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. That the CDC right there considers a select agent during that time. I don't believe it does anymore, but at the time, it considered that a select agent along with other variants. So they are contradicting themselves right here in their own released statement. According to local officials, the CDC knew that absent testing, local officials would have to destroy all samples pursuant to a forthcoming abatement order. The abatement basically means a cleanup order. So CDC would issue a cleanup order, and that would be the end of it. They would have to destroy all the samples. The CDC also stated that state officials did not test any of the remaining transgenic mice based on concerns over the accuracy of potential testing. So they basically said, stop testing everything. You're not going to get anything right. We already know everything. Stop testing, destroy everything. Not sketchy at all. After also not testing anything. Now we are going to get into the CDC's official reasoning that they did not test any of the samples. So according to official accounts, in a subsequent conversation with the CDC in early September 2023, so this is in September now, this is 9 months past when this biolab was first discovered by officials. Local officials again pressed the CDC on why they refused to test any potential pathogens. The CDC official informed the local officials, so this is a official CDC statement, that it was illegal for the CDC to test any samples that were not expressly labeled as a select agent. City manager Nicole Zaeva expressed shock at this fact. She asked whether, if that were the case, the CDC had any authority to stop a terrorist in the United States who simply removed the label off of a viral of deadly virus. The CDC official said that the CDC had no authority to test the deadly virus in that hypothetical, and that it noted it was a gap in its authority. This characterization of the CDC's authority appears to be false, which it is. That would make no sense at all. That would mean that the CDC had no authority to test any pathogen that wasn't properly labeled, which we know isn't true, because that's exactly what the CDC did in 2001 with the anthrax letters. That also is what the CDC does anytime they have a shipment of diseases that come in from somewhere. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but that means that anytime a shipment comes in and it's unlabeled, they can't test it and they just have to let it go. That is not how the CDC does anything. We know that. We can look back at 2001 when they had the unlabeled anthrax powder that was found and the CDC went and tested it. But the CDC here is claiming that they actually have no legal authority to do that, and they actually can't test anything that isn't properly labeled, which is outright false. Because they didn't test anything and that abatement order was issued, local officials had to destroy all of the samples, which they ended up having to destroy over 103 tons of general waste that included laboratory equipment and 448 gallons of medical and biological waste. In the process of doing so, local officials and contractors reported that they found a freezer that was labeled Ebola with silver sealed bags found inside, consistent with how the Reedley Bio-Lab operators stored sensitive biological material. So, because the CDC didn't test anything and they didn't go through and actually clear out this site themselves, local officials had to go through, and they ended up finding things that were labeled as Ebola, and they did not test them. They could not do anything with it, and they have no idea if that actually has Ebola in it. That is insane. So, that is where the CDC portion ends, and most of this portion ends with the actual biolab. To recap, it's discovered in December of 2022. Takes the FBI to get out there. They do their investigation. They end up closing it. March 16th, local officials go back into it. They find 2 individuals who refuse to identify themselves, both of whom leave very quickly after the local officials get there. Everything was locked up, padlocked. So they left, came back, went through the area. They found a bunch of vials, waste. They went through the labs. They requested CDC gets out there. CDC refused, hangs up on them. It takes them getting their congressman to get with the CDC in order to get them out there, and finally pressures them. CDC gets out there. They're there for 2 days. They confirm that there is the presence of biological materials, one of which they confirm is a select agent as listed. And then they refuse to do any testing of the samples, any of the unlabeled or coded samples, and tell them to destroy everything because the CDC claims that it is illegal for them to actually test anything that isn't properly labeled. And even then, they still didn't test the vials that were labeled to confirm if that's actually what was in there. And then that's the end of it. Nothing else was done from there. They now we're going to get into the investigation in the background of who actually ran this biolab. So we mentioned the man who was responsible for this biolab. His name was Jesse Zhu. He went under the alias of David He while being in the United States. Though the corporation Universal Medical Incorporated (UMI) or Universal Meditech Incorporated (UMI) was owned and operated the Reedley Bio-Lab, Zhu is a citizen of the People's Republic of China. He is associated with the People's Republic of China and government-linked companies. He is currently wanted in Canada for contempt of court and is subject to a $330 million judgment for stealing American intellectual property. He was able to acquire these apparent pathogens even though he was a wanted fugitive and operated an unlicensed and unregulated laboratory. It comes out later that he most likely obtained some of these pathogens prior to even coming to the United States, and he smuggled them from Canada to the United States or from Nigeria to the United States. But other pathogens he just requested from laboratories, which, because there isn't really any regulation between requesting from licensing or anything to show that you are an actual licensed laboratory, they requested it from universities and they gave it to them because they believed that they were licensed and operating legally, which they were not. While living in the People's Republic of China in the early 2000s, Zhu served as a vice chairman in the PRC state-controlled enterprise based in Zhejiang, Henan Premier Aid Biological Engineering Company Limited, or Pioneer Aid China. So he was a vice chairman in the Chinese government in the Hunan province. Summarizing what this guy did, basically he worked for a company that did military and civil fusion, and he worked with cattle companies in China. He then moved to Canada and operated several businesses there that were again dealing with cattle. While he was there, while Zhu was in Canada, he operated several businesses that worked with the Canadian government and the Chinese government on cattle, and he stole intellectual property from both the Canadian cattle farms and the American cattle farms. This stolen intellectual property totaled estimates up to $1.3 billion with a B. In 2016, after years of litigation with XY over his IP theft, so intellectual property theft, the Supreme Court of British Columbia in Canada found Zhu guilty of fraud on an epic scale that resulted in one of the largest awards in the Canadian court. The court found that Zhu, whose operations extended to China as well as Canada, planned to steal the technology to the point where XY's market would collapse. The IP theft directly benefited People's Republic of China state-controlled enterprises like Zhu's PRC-based companies, and it also benefited IND Group's two head offices in China and Beijing, two head offices in China in Beijing and Qingdao. So, stealing intellectual property that would lead to the collapse of the Canadian cattle enterprise, and that would greatly benefit China in Beijing and Qingdao. After this ruling, he fled to the United States, where he then began operating again several businesses and founded the first biolab that was in Fresno, which burned down due to faulty wiring. That then he moved from that area up into the Reedley Bio-Lab, where ultimately, because of the hard work of Code Enforcement Officer Harper, they were able to discover and blow all of this open, that then nothing got handled correctly. However, he was apprehended. I believe they did get him. And he is in prison. I hope. I will see if he is. I really hope he is. Future bet here. So, I'm sure as all of you are aware, because this is probably all over the news and this video is coming out day after this was released, but there was a second biolab that was found in Las Vegas that is directly connected to this biolab. So David He has been in prison since 2023. However, the Las Vegas lab was actually two homes that were owned by him, and they also contained thousands of biological samples and material. The David, he obviously he's been in prison since 2023. So he's not the main suspect in all of this. However, he was the owner of both of the properties, so there's a definite connection there. The person who was arrested on the scene is a 55-year-old Ori Solomon, who is identified as the property manager. So she's the property manager. He, she, I don't know what they are, is the property manager, and David, he was the property owner. So there's definitely a connection there. I'm going to be looking more into this to the day after right now, which is February 3rd, and hopefully I'll be putting out a video a lot sooner than it took me to get this video out. So called it in the beginning of the video. Yep, there's definitely going to be more of these labs found across the United States, and it looks like the next one was Las Vegas. It doesn't state in here that he is. While Zoo was in the United States, so what was the purpose of the Reedley Bio-Lab? They tried stating that they had an actual legitimate purpose for operating. The legitimate purpose that they claimed to have was the committee found, so this committee found that they had obtained evidence indicating that Zhu and his associates at the Reedley Bio-Lab were purchasing counterfeit tests from the People's Republic of China and reselling them in the United States as made in America. Reedley Bio-Lab contained dozens of large boxes full of PRC-made medical devices, test kits, shipping manifests, and for these items from the People's Republic of China, so they did keep their records, and they found them, and bills indicating that the acquisition of these test kits from the People's Republic of China companies, in some cases these companies were affiliated with Zhu, were allegedly used to test for current pandemic, pregnancy, ovulation, and certain narcotics. The FDA administration determined that UMI test kits were not to be safe and effective, and they issued a recall. So there was a recall issued for all of these tests because they were being sold inside of the United States. Of course, they weren't actually made in the United States. They were made in China, and they were just brought to the U.S. and repackaged as made in the U.S. And that was their legitimate purpose for operating. Of course, when you knew that that wasn't a legitimate purpose, they weren't licensed, and it was very, very clear. There was no evidence that the Reedley Bio-Lab was selling test kits for any pathogen except for current pandemic. The select committee reviewed documents found at the Reedley Bio-Lab, such as sales brochures, fake test kits found on site, the FDA recall notice, and archive web data. These materials showed that aside from the current pandemic test strips, UMI was not selling any diagnostic strips related to any pathogen while it operated Reedley. So they weren't selling any test strips that were not for current pandemic. But they did claim that they were using the other pathogens for research into the other test kits, which makes no sense because there's little to no market for test strips for things like Ebola or HIV for the strains that they were doing, which you don't use a test strip for that. You have to do a blood sample. So it doesn't make sense, let alone test kits created in an unlicensed laboratory. So of course, no one wants to buy these. They're unlicensed. They're unregulated. Why would they trying to be selling these things and no one's going to buy them? It doesn't make sense. While Zhu's fraudulent activity itself required little overhead maintenance, maintaining large numbers of apparent pathogen samples, medical equipment, potentially hazardous chemicals, and transgenic mice was expensive. It was found that they were getting wire transfers to pay for a lot of this equipment directly from the People's Republic of China and companies tied to the government of China. Getting into the samples that they found that potentially contained Ebola, the apparent presence of the Ebola samples at the Reedley Bio-Lab is the clearest example of a lack of apparent legitimate, even for a profit-motivated criminal motive in the operation of an illegal facility. So this completely takes out any legitimate purpose that they could possibly have or profit-motivated criminal activity. This is clearly something nefarious going on. The need for Ebola tests is minimal, and the potential market is extremely small. There's no way that they were operating this as a illegal, legitimate business. I say illegal, legitimate, like they're not manufacturing these test strips illegally to sell legitimately, if that makes sense. because the market for these test strips is extremely small. It would make no sense for them to go through such large effort. They would never make their money back. The need for Ebola tests is minimal. The potential market is extremely small. Experimenting with Ebola, even for benign purposes, is very dangerous. Case fatality rates for Ebola have ranged between 25 to 90%. And this is just for past outbreaks. So if you have it, the mortality rate is 25 to 90%. And then the handling of Ebola, this is the most outrageous part. Handling of any Ebola samples in any legitimate purpose for research or anything, per law, has to be done in a BSL-4 laboratory. If you don't know what a BSL-4 laboratory is, that is a Biosafety Lab 4. There are not many of these in the world. One of the BSL-4s in the United States is the CDC itself. And clearly, this biolab that was run illegally in a rundown warehouse is not a BSL-4. They state it is unclear how any non-BSL facility, let alone the Reedley Bio-Lab, would potentially be able to acquire this deadly pathogen in the first place. So they have no idea how they would even get their hands on this if it wasn't through some illegal route that they took. That covers pretty much the entirety of the Reedley Bio-Lab. So, to give a recap, it was found in December of 2022 by Officer Harper. FBI came in, did their investigation, left 2 months later. In March, the local officials from the Reedley tried to enter in. They found that there was 2 individuals who did not identify themselves and left pretty quickly once the officials got there. They found that everything was locked, so they went and got a warrant to make sure everything was official. Came back with a warrant on March 16th in 2023. Found that there was thousands of vials of biological material, some labeled, some not. Thousands of mice that they ended up euthanizing. They tried to get a hold of the CDC to come out and test everything. CDC hung up on them multiple times, and it took them getting their Congressman Jim Costa to reach out to the CDC and get them to actually come and do an investigation. From there, the CDC finally came out. They were there from May 2nd to May 4th. They ultimately concluded that there was no select agents, even though in the list that they said there is a select agent on that list per the own CDC's admission. And then they did not test any of the samples, whether it was labeled or unlabeled, because they claim that testing any unlabeled biological sample is illegal and outside of their authority. And they then order everything to be destroyed. Local officials reluctantly go with that order, and in the process of that order, they find samples that were labeled as Ebola, which they could never confirm nor deny because the CDC refused to do any testing. And then that's the end of it. The individual who is responsible for this tried requesting that they don't destroy the samples and that they actually give them back to him through another unlicensed medical facility, which thankfully they denied. And as far as I'm aware, the individual responsible for all of this, David He, which was his alias, his real name being Jesse Zhu, does not appear to be under arrest. However, he may be under arrest now. All of this is coming out through a congressional committee that is investigating the entire process of this, and in the final portion of this, this is their final ruling on what they say about the CDC's response and everything that happened. So they officially say that the CDC's response was unacceptable. The CDC's response was inadequate and raised serious concerns about standard practices. It is unacceptable that the CDC, according to accounts from local officials, refusal to take phone calls from the city and county officials concerned about the biolab found in their region. Even if the CDC normally works through state agencies, it could have given this necessary contact information to local officials. It should not require a member of Congress, in this case Congressman Jim Costa, to personally call the CDC or any other federal agency for them to potentially provide meaningful support. This is the This is the Congress Committee's own words, not my own. This is word for word the Congressional Committee's words on the CDC. The CDC's refusal to test any samples is likewise baffling. The CDC observed in its own reporting that thousands of vials had unclear labeling, coded labeling, or no identifications. The Bio-Lab signs were around many of these unlabeled vials, and the labeled vials included risk group 2 and risk group 3 pathogens, which they also included select agents as admitted by the CDC. Despite the probability that the unlabeled or coded vials contained additional unknown and dangerous pathogens, the CDC officials refused to take any further investigative steps. The fact that they seemingly took the word of the Bio-Lab operators and noted fraudsters and concluded that the named labels are wholly correct is also strange. It is entirely within the realm of possibility that the vial of Toxoplasmosis gondii, for instance, were filled with an entirely different and potentially far more dangerous pathogen. Because of this, the Select Committee, and more importantly, the American people, can never resolve what pathogens Zoo and Reedley Bio-Lab possessed. The CDC's continuing refusal to test pathogens despite reasonable requests and offer to pay from local officials facing a concerned populace simply does not make sense. Despite the CDC's official statements, the city manager, Zayeba, that there does not appear to be any law prohibiting the CDC from testing unlabeled samples. If the CDC knew that a specific sample was a select agent, which they did, it would not need to test it. Even if the CDC were limited to testing select agents, it falls well within the authority to test suspected select agents. Furthermore, if the CDC had a limited capability and other federal government organizations like the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense may have had the means to assist, which 1,000% they do. I know who they could have called in. Even if they didn't call the Department of Homeland Security, they could have called the Department of Defense, and I know that there are people who are close to that area that would have been more than happy, would have been the best moment of their career if they would have gotten the call to, hey, we got to go do some site exploitation on a suspected biolab. That would have made their entire year. That would have been the coolest thing they could have possibly done, and it would have been so cool for them to go do it. And for some reason, they didn't call them. This entire handling of the CDC, completely baffling, and I do not understand why they handled this. When this was brought to my attention at work, we could not fathom that this is how the CDC handled this. And it was almost hysterical. We could not believe this was real. This is how they ended up handling all of this. Continues saying, it seems to have made this claim without conducting any investigation beyond reading the labels, and that were in English or limited. Oh. Okay. Continue on with the final part of this. The CDC insisted that there was no evidence that select agents were within the Reedley Bio-Lab or that Zoo and UMI imported infectious agents, and insufficient evidence at the time of any legal violations, even though there was just the fact that they would claim that in an official capacity is mind-boggling, because there is so much. Just the claim that they were disposing of test mice is a violation. The fact that there was any testing of mice happening at all at this facility is illegal and a violation. So it makes no sense that they would claim that there was no violations at all taking place at this laboratory. They finish here with saying the CDC also clearly did not review any documents or containers that were found within the Reedley Bio-Lab, as the Select Committee did find evidence showing importation of infectious agents, substances, or vectors. So the Congress found evidence. I cannot stress this enough. Congress found evidence of importation of infectious agents and substances. But the CDC, whose but one of the largest things that they do is dealing with something of fraudulent importation of medical, diseases and medical stuff. And they didn't find it in any of their investigation, but Congress somehow was able to figure it out and find direct evidence, which, again, baffling to me. In conclusion, after all of this, at a minimum, Reedley Bio-Lab shows that a profound threat that unlicensed and unknown biolabs possess in our country, if that wasn't already clear enough. At worst, the investigation revealed significant gaps in our nation's defenses and pathogen-related regulations that present a grave national security risk that could be exploited in the future. It is therefore incumbent upon Congress and the executive branch to address these vulnerabilities now before it's too late. And that is the story of the Reedley Bio-Lab, the illegal biolab that was funded by the People's Republic of China that was importing infectious diseases into the United States for illicit research, which we will never know what research they were doing, because the CDC, in their own claim and stated by the Congressional Committee, that they did not test any samples that were present to confirm what was actually there and what they were actually doing. Thank you so much for watching. This has been a wild ride. If you stuck to the very end, thank you so much. I am so grateful that you did so. If you want more videos like this in the future, please let me know. I will have the full congressional documents listed below so you can read them for yourselves and just discover how crazy this entire story was. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.